good evening from India. I'll just talk a little bit about what we at Center of Law and Policy Research have been working on in the past 3 years. So our Equality Prohibition of Discrimination Bill is an overarching equality law that prohibits discrimination on various grounds. The way we're approaching it is by focusing on the intersectional nature of discrimination. I see that a lot of other people who've been working on discrimination laws in their countries are looking at the intersectionality of various identities. And we feel that's, I think, the way to go forward at this point in time. As part of our work with ERT, we worked on advocating it to the larger civil society and focused on building a coalition with other groups that are also working on equality and non-discrimination, apart from only approaching the policymakers. While disseminating it to the civil society was in itself important, we also felt it was incredibly significant to build a kind of public momentum to support the bill before it was tabled in the parliament. So, with this context, I would like to hear from Dumiso. Why did your organization, Success Capital, focus its strategy on bringing together civil society to advocate for the development and adoption of comprehensive rather than specific equality legislation? And a follow-up question to that, why was it important to build a coalition to pursue this objective? And what are the benefits of a collaborative approach?
Great, thank you so much, Mansi. And I think I'll target both questions at once. I think the first is that, just as a result of Success Capital's work, its establishment, its mandate, and its philosophy has always been intersectional. And I think, it's important to recognize this, and that in many instances, young people are not always able to articulate some of the more common development or advocacy narratives. And so I think, it's important to speak, from that lens, one, a decolonial lens, a feminist lens. And I think, that then speaks to context. Context really matters, particularly, when we're engaged as a part of, the research study or the advocacy work around the adoption of comprehensive equality laws with the Equal Rights Trust. It was under the context of Botswana's upcoming constitutional review. So having that in mind, along with some of the other commitments that often exclude, different marginalized groups, inclusive of LGBTI, inclusive of sex workers. And so I think it really does allow for linking to governance and legal systems, inclusive of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, inclusive of the African Peer Review Mechanism and the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, because all of these don't necessarily operate in silos. And we recognize that there are different government departments that might be responsible, but at the end of the day, the state's responsibility is still universal for citizens. And I think, this is important for us because this is amidst an environment that remains the fourth most unequal out of 104 countries by Gini coefficient, and a country that has moved from the second to the first in reported rape incidents globally, a country that hasn't ratified the Maputo Protocol or the African Youth Charter. And so it's important to speak about it from a contextual lens in ensuring and safeguarding the different rights of different groups. Secondly, it's also about civic participation and meaningful engagement, particularly in a dualist system where traditional governance and a customary court system is a factor. Also noting that socioeconomic rights are not justiciable in Botswana's context. And so you could say it lightens the load for other players as well in being able to collaborate and in being able to speak to equality and non-discrimination. I think also it helps allow, addressing some of the gaps, particularly when you're looking at how in 2015, Botswana had enacted a protection from termination of employment on the basis of sexual orientation, but somehow still criminalized same-sex intercourse or relations. Secondly, the non-recognition of marital rape, as well as the difficulty of the burden of proof in sexual harassment cases at work, in learning environments, spiritual spaces, as well as many other safe spaces. And so I think it really allows for us to not just, think, beyond the box and not just operate from a business as usual perspective, but really in ensuring that there can be be ways to alleviate and mitigate the systemic and structural violence that continues to persist, particularly when noting a more incremental approach to law. And I think also, it's also speaking to, securing inroads from some of these incremental sort of wins that we've gained. And I say this, almost, I think 2 weeks later, after the government has opposed or appealed the milestone High Court case judgment from 11 June 2019 that decriminalized same-sex relations. And so I think it's really quite critical and important to recognize that it's a much broader issue and that you do need many civil society actors, those who are obviously enabling and progressive from other sort of sectors to help not just create dialogue, but also to promote equality within the context of advocacy. I think, this is really an important approach, particularly in sort of alleviating some of the impacts of politicization, sexualization, and subjugation of groups, and more notably, particularly because Botswana has ensured that a human rights-based approach to the HIV response ensures inclusion, that human rights barriers to HIV access and prevention, and also committing to the UPR, along with many other commitments that speak to diversity and inclusion, but not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily reflect in practice. And so it's really about ensuring some of these inroads, aren't sort of compromised as a result of anti-gender ideology, conservative or religious right groups, and other elements that are quite regressive to marginalized groups. And then lastly, I like speaking about solidarity as sunshine. And, there have been a few elements that have already been spoken about in the context of intersectionality. But I think, it really does allow for collaboration, as opposed to competition, particularly from a resourcing lens. Like I had mentioned, it does lighten the load in terms of the challenges that one has to face, from a judicial, health, tribal administration systems, navigation and responding, particularly to challenges within, the red tape, and sort of ensuring that stakeholders are there to be accountable and enable civic participation of excluded groups. Thank you.